It's important to point out here that when we first started the free speech movement with our radical tactics and so forth, many faculty who were sympathetic to us in terms of a principle were upset with us for rocking the boat because Clark Kerr had come in as president of the university precisely as a liberal, all right, I use the term advisedly, but that was the idea, as a liberal who had opposed the loyalty oath and would heal the wounds that the loyalty oath had inflicted by allowing faculty who had been fired to come back to the university to teach with their rank, with their prior rank. And so the faculty felt very positive about Clark Kerr and were very worried about us rocking the boat. And of course, it was true we were rocking the boat. And it was also true that Clark Kerr was under tremendous pressure from the right-wing people, who really didn't want any concessions to us and just wanted us smashed. And that included Alex Sheriffs, who was a vice chancellor we mentioned before. It also included Ed Strong, who was the chancellor of Berkeley at the time, and really way over his head in terms of trying to deal with this crisis, which is why Kerr came in and took over. And there were right-wing legislators who were pressuring and so forth. So when the decision was made for us to be arrested at Sproul Hall, that decision was not made by Clark Kerr. That decision was made by the governor. It was Edmund G. Brown who ordered the arrests over the objections of Clark Kerr. And that's just the history. That's just what happened. First thing I'd say in terms of faculty support, so remember that I'm 20 at this time, and I'm an undergraduate. So my connections to faculty are fairly limited. It was the graduate students who were most important in mobilizing faculty support, because they were the ones that had the most direct connection to faculty individually. Now, Mario and I met with, not necessarily together, but we met with faculty, like Reggie Zelnick, for example. At that time, John Searle, who was very supportive of free speech movement. Leon Wofsy, who was in the bacteriology department. Jacobus Tenbrook, professor. Tom Parkinson, who was in the English department. These were people that we met with at various times, and they formed the core of a very important faculty group. There was also Henry Rizovsky, who was in the history department, who was sort of on the periphery of this, but became increasingly supportive as time went on. And also an anthropologist named Gerald Berriman was very supportive of the free speech movement. So, we had, and another very supportive person was a man named Michel Loev, who was in the mathematics department, who had been part of the French resistance during the war. He was very radical. He was a wonderful man, wonderful man. I met with him a lot.
And you had some people who were connected with the loyalty oath controversy.
Yes, well, that was like Parkinson, Tom Parkinson, for example, absolutely, and I think Tenbrook as well. Yes, absolutely. And Leon Wofsy came from he hadn't been in the communist movement for a long time, but he had been very active in the YCL.
So the loyalty oath was a very big thing, which everybody knew about, even though it had already been largely resolved by the time I got to Berkeley. And a number of the people who were very active ultimately in defense of the students and of the free speech movement were people who themselves had been fired because of the loyalty oath and then rehired. So it was a very strong element in the consciousness of the Berkeley faculty before the free speech movement ever started. Very few of the faculty members appreciated what was happening initially. When the car was surrounded, there were a few faculty members, I think John Searle in the first place, who got up on the car and recognized what was happening, and especially appreciated what the nature of the controversy was at that point, because these students had come, as is well known now, from the heroic freedom voting movement in the South that summer, and were certainly idealistic, impassioned, and not ready to simply drop their beliefs and their right to speak simply because of institutional rules and regulations. Anyway, that all changed when the administration remained very obstinate, Chancellor Strong in the first place, and particularly when the major events took place of the occupation of Sproul Hall and the eventual arrests. And that was the point at which the faculty went into shock and, to their credit, recognized that the fight was a good fight, that they should be part of it. And at that point, I would say a majority of the faculty moved over to the side of the students, ultimately culminating in the Committee of 200 and the plan that it put forward that served as a basis for an overwhelming vote in the academic senate that represented the victory of the free speech movement.
Most of the people, really articulate opponents of the FSM in the faculty senate, were Europeans who, rightly or wrongly, saw the FSM as a kind of proto-fascist movement, that students had reacted against the Weimar Republic, and they didn't like the Weimar Republic, and a lot of their rhetoric they saw as being similar to the FSM rhetoric. I never thought for a second there was any danger of the FSM going fascist. I think that was a misperception. I mean, I don't want to say I laughed off what people like Foyer was saying, because these were good people, and it was a shame they left. And they sincerely believed it, and so I had to listen with a certain amount of respect, because they were obviously worked up. It wasn't just a clever rhetorical trick. It was something they said from the bottom of their heart. But I never believed it for a second that these people were like Hitler. And Mario, of all the people, I mean, Mario was one. I don't want to be a leader. Don't always choose me. We don't have a leader in this movement. He's an anti-Hitler.
Although the final turning point came at the Greek Theater. And that's where, once again, while supposedly the atmosphere was one of dialogue and discussion, that wasn't supposed to embrace the free speech movement. That wasn't supposed to be one that allowed another voice, just the voice of officialdom.
We heard all these boring speeches about now this is a new era and we will have freedom under law.
Salvio got up and walked to the podium, and as he stood at the podium, two campus policemen tackled him and dragged him off stage.
Mario came out to say a word or two, and regardless of what he was going to say, the facts were the police threw him to the ground, really roughed him up, put a baton on his neck so that he couldn't speak, and I was about 8 yards away.
I want every person here to know and understand fully what just occurred when the president of this university finished speaking. I was with Mario. Mario went backstage before the meeting began and spoke with the chairman of the meeting, Professor Scalapino, and requested to be permitted to speak. He did not want to make a long and involved speech. Mario left his seat in the front of the Greek theater and walked quietly and with dignity, and I was with him, up upon the stage. When Mario approached the microphone, he never was given even the opportunity to say anything, but was seized by the police and brought backstage. After great response from the audience, he was permitted to make the announcement he wanted to make. He was released by the police, and he is here now.
It was a horrifying thing to watch. And it was especially meaningful because there's all this talk about freedom under law. And then the law comes out and they put Mario down on the ground with a stick on his neck. Mm-hmm. It was a metaphor. It just summed up what was wrong with the present situation.
And the point again of the intervention of treating free speech and demand for free speech by simply demanding silence and force, I think that's what finally really swung the tide.
You have to think the gods have smiled. I mean, how could you possibly have staged it better than that? And all the professors, barring a few, who had been anti-student, who had said, well, we grudgingly know that we have to end this conflict, and that the easiest way to end it is to side with the students, a profound number of them came over to the student side, right there on the spot.
The whole idea of the Greek theater was a very obvious attempt to try and regain control over a situation. And I don't think I was very hostile to that, because all of us could see that although Strong was certainly doomed, that Kerr was also at risk. And I probably went into the Greek theater thinking we have to get everything back to normal to save Kerr. But that's not the way I exited the Greek theater. No, I exited the Greek theater. You've got to do something about these people who will just knock you down and use a baton on you.
But I will attempt. I will attempt to tell you a little of my life, to try to establish a bona fide, and I'll tell you now the reason why I'm going to do that. Because it is my belief that the basic issue here is not free speech. This is a specific point. The basic issue is the loss of contact, and consequently the loss of faith and trust among members of the academic community on this campus, vertically and laterally.
I think it's quite clear that our struggle has just begun. The very fact that something like 810 students are about to face some courts here in Alameda County, I think constitutes a definite threat to the civil rights movement, and we're going to have to pull together in order to support these students so that we can continue to maintain the civil rights movement here in Northern California.
People knew where our position was, and so I was invited to go to this committee of 200. It's an arbitrary name. There were a bunch of people in the hall. And Charlie Sellers and Charles Muscatine and John Searle and Reggie Zelnick and Bill Kornhauser And Kenneth Stamp had put together this resolution. It was debated at the meeting. And my first speech on this whole topic was at that meeting. It was very short. I put up my hand and I said, I think you have to put in something more about respecting whatever it was about the students. It was a plug for acknowledging the role of the students a bit more. And for that, I was invited to the next drafting session of the Committee of 200, the Executive Committee, as they call themselves.
So when the Academic Senate met, and the vote was 824 to 115 to support the demands of the free speech movement, which meant freedom of speech without restriction, no penalties, and the only regulations would be of time, place, and manner. Yeah, that meant, that was all. No regulation of content, and that it also meant that you could bring speakers to the campus, you'd have freedom of speech. And that the First Amendment would be honored, the 14th Amendment would be honored just as it was on the campus, just as it was anywhere else in the United States. That there would not be restrictions. That's what they were voting on. And that's how they voted. And that Senate meeting was historic, and everybody knew it. And when the faculty came out, we were standing outside, and they had broadcasts, they had microphones set up so we could hear. And when the faculty came out and we started to applaud as they came out, many of them were crying. These old men were crying. And the reason was that we all understood, I think in that moment, that it had broken the back of that kind of McCarthyite repression that had so terrified people.
There was a feeling of elation. I mean, it wasn't just that the mood shifted, that the cause became theirs, at least on the part of a large section of faculty. So the victory wasn't just a victory for somebody else, it was a victory for very basic ideals and beliefs that were being joined in this battle. And I remember that very well. I mean, in a certain sense, maybe faculty shouldn't have taken as much credit as it did, because it came in as sort of Johnny-come-latelys for the most part. But still, it got there, and it did what it was supposed to do. It did the good fight, as Reggie Zelnick called it in his book. And they felt pride. They were excited. They were elated.
The overwhelmingly one-sided vote on December 8th was because of what happened in the Greek theater. Remember, we were all there. It was a university event. It wasn't like going to hear a rock star or something. That was our job, was to go up and be told we were starting a new era of freedom under law. I think a lot of people really wanted to get the whole thing behind them as quickly as possible because they didn't like all this turmoil in Sproul Plaza.
The faculty voted overwhelmingly to side with the students, and the administration, also very weary of the fight, realized that they were probably losing court, and it was gonna head for court. We had the ACLU was on our side. We knew that we might have lost the immediate battle on the campus for free speech rights, but we would certainly win it in court, and the administration knew that also. The universities council told them, if this goes to court, it's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court, and you're going to lose, and it's going to cost you a bloody fortune.
Yes, I think the administration did realize that Strong was a liability and decided to replace him with Meyerson. It was a difference in tone, and it was a concession to us in a certain sense that Strong had not been able to handle the free speech movement in a satisfactory way. Meyerson came in and spoke on the steps of Sproul Hall and announced that for a certain period of time every day it would be a free speech area. However, there was a caveat with that, and that was how I got thrown out of school 3 more times, because I spoke over an illegal microphone. They would not allow us to use microphones. They told us we could use bullhorns, but we could not use generator-powered microphones. And so, but of course nobody could hear you if you had a bullhorn, so we always used the illegal microphones. So many of us were thrown out of school because of that.
And actually, Martin Meyerson didn't last that long.
No, he didn't last that long either, because he didn't, well, again, it was the same thing. He underestimated the student movement. They thought that they could control it a lot more than they could.
One of my views on the FSM is it's like your basic soap opera plot. You have a family, something goes drastically wrong, then the story is about how do you bring the family back together. That's the plot of every soap opera in America. But that was also the plot of the FSM in terms of the university's consciousness of itself and its community as an educational institution.
And then the regents, because of the faculty vote and because of the mobilization of huge numbers of people, including the labor councils and and the Democratic Party and people like Willie Brown and the whole civil rights movement, because of that national mobilization, the regents were forced then to concede that their regulations would not go beyond the purview of the First and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. So we won that. And that rule then swept across the country. That's the positive.
The student
Everywhere across the country, administrators began to change their rules as the students mounted protests. So we gave license to that. And I remember touring the country with Mario, and I think Suzanne was with us. And no matter where we went, thousands of students came, faculty came, standing ovations before we ever said anything. We were just, I remember being at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I remember being at Queens College. I remember Mario was at Columbia. I think he went to Harvard. No matter where we went, there were these huge crowds and huge reception that we received. So that mobilized. That was very important. A rolling impact.
Yeah.
And I think it also influenced the Civil Rights Act of '65, the Voting Rights Act, because it created a certain momentum that in the country. It shifted the country in a certain direction for a period of time. So I think it was very, very positive. On the negative side, in the gubernatorial race in '68, when Edmund G. Brown was up for re-election, he was opposed by Ronald Reagan. And Reagan apparently decided that he should pound the issue of student protests. And students were out of hand and so forth. A lot of his advisors thought he was nuts, that this wasn't, that it was a non-issue, a non-starter, but he insisted, and he was right. Reagan insisted that this was a sledgehammer that he could use to win the governor's race, and he did. It was not the only sledgehammer, but it was the one, a big one that he used. And so, part of what happened then, you can say, is that as a consequence of our movement, the student agitation and student movement, Reagan was elected governor, which gave him entree into the presidency.
I know.
So nobody could have predicted that. Nobody could have seen that. Nobody could have known that kind of backlash was going to come. So that's how I would assess it. It was a huge movement. It had a huge impact. It deeply impacted the people who were involved in it. It had a profound impact on universities across the country in the months after it was over. And it influenced a lot of what happened in Europe in the spring of '68 in Paris, and also, I might add, in Prague. The Prague Spring was in '68. And these were worker-student coalitions, groups. The French almost overturned, both almost overturned their governments. And of course, the Prague Spring ended with the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia.
I think there's no question that the free speech movement sparked similar movements everywhere. They developed their own form, and so the free speech movement can't claim credit for them. But very definitely the free speech movement emboldened and encouraged similar movements everywhere. First of all, on our own campuses, Stanford, Columbia. I visited Michigan State at that time to give a seminar and saw a similar movement there, Wisconsin. But beyond that, internationally, certainly the movements that took place in 1968 in France were very much influenced. They went beyond. They were much more political in character in terms of society in general. But certainly the spirit was one that was a wave that started with the free speech movement. Mm-hmm. And it also extended to movements in Czechoslovakia and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. issue was free speech. The issue was precisely the issue that that students and the university were not in an ivory tower, and part of being a good student, or for that matter, as it turns out, a good faculty member, was to be concerned with your community, with your country, with what goes on in the world, and not to view being in the university as a vacation from life. So that's the fundamental issue. And it's quite interesting that generation after generation, it's frequently the young people who kick over the traces and bring about change. So to operate on the basis that young people have to be a silent generation and shut up actually goes not against the young people, but it goes against the whole way in which a country or a university refreshes itself and gets new ideas. So that was our outlook at the time.
I do see that whole FSM experience at Berkeley was important in itself, important for Berkeley. And John Searle saw it as being important for speech, but I think it was also a moral test of America, because this was at a time of the freedom rides and the concerted effort to end Jim Crow in the South. And what really gave rise to the FSM was the efforts of CORE and people to have a table and to mobilize for that. It wasn't just free speech in an abstract way, it was free speech as a way of implementing a major change for the status of blacks in this country.
The free speech movement did overcome for me the anonymous feeling. I was connected to a group of people who were doing something more than themselves. I think that's the really huge lesson of being political and getting involved in a political movement, is the experience of being part of something greater than oneself. When people are in movement, when people are in motion, people organize themselves into the needed committees and the needed tasks. It gave me, the FSM sort of gave me a faith in that concept.
It's often overlooked, but that did something for the idea of the university that was really quite important. It's a place of learning, not just a place of expertise. It was a place of community. So yes, I made many friends. People could respect each other. You know, they did something else for me, because I was self-conscious about my background, not apologetic about it, even though I changed my mind, which I had the absolute right to do about many things that I believed as a young person. But I wasn't at all apologetic about thinking for myself what I had done, how I spent my life. Nevertheless, the whole impact of McCarthyism, loyalty oaths, were one where you felt a little bit like a pariah. And that influenced my own behavior to some extent. And the students did me a heck of a big favor by sort of putting all that stuff aside and getting to what really counts.
A real democracy is really important for having a movement. If you really have a democratic organization, it really strengthens your fight, because not only do people feel they have a stake in what's going on because they've contributed to it, but they contribute many wonderful, interesting ideas that you might never come up with, you know, because everybody brings their own experiences to bear.
The encouragement that it gave us was, you can do anything. You may be 19 years old, but you can do anything. And that's what enabled people like Alice Waters to open a restaurant. That she didn't wonder whether someone who was 23 years old could go out there and change the world. She knew she could. We just went ahead and did it. And huge numbers of things that happened as a result of that empowerment of my generation in many, many, many ways. In music, the arts and the sciences, we could do anything, and we knew we could do anything because we'd done it.
I'm very happy to have been involved in it and to have contributed something towards it. And I think it showed the main thing that I try to say to my students today is it is possible to make social change. It is possible to mobilize huge numbers of people and at least temporarily shift the balance of power so that you can actually get a progressive change.